Thank you. Jeremy serves as a supervisory oceanographer at NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory in Seattle, Washington. He received his doctorate in marine chemistry from Rasmus in 2006, and prior to coming on board at PML in 2012, he was an associate faculty with the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where he remains an affiliate professor with the Institute of Marine Sciences. He's been a contributor to more than 30 peer-reviewed manuscripts. His primary research interests include constraining carbon dioxide fluxes and ocean acidification within coastal regions, particularly within high latitudes. Jeremy currently oversees large aspects of NOAA's carbon and ocean acidification observing network, using a variety of autonomous platforms including moorings, gliders, and floats. While his primary focus is along U.S. West Coast and Alaska, I've asked him to offer a talk to NECAN specifically on an Ocean Acidification Sensitivity Index project, which has been primarily funded through the Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy. The overall goal of this project is to assess the potential risk of ocean acidification on marine resources within the state of Alaska, and it incorporates the use of chemical, biological, and socioeconomic data. Using this approach, they've been able to gain insight into which coastal communities may be at greater risk or those which may be more resilient to ocean acidification. I think it offers us a good illustration of the types of products which we may be wanting to promote as part of NECAN. And so with that, I will hand it off to Jeremy.
All right, thank you very much, Dwight, and thanks everybody for joining this morning. I'm sure most of you are on the East Coast, and so the picture I have on my title slide here probably looks more familiar to you guys this morning than it does to us on the West Coast or even the folks up in Alaska. But I am excited to talk about this today. As Dwight said, it is going to be focused on Alaska, but the work that we've done I think is very applicable to all the coastal regions around the U.S., and so particularly within the ocean acidification program within NOAA, we're trying to use this as a model to now build out into the other regional areas around the country. So I'm going to talk about this sort of perceptions, risk, and uncertainties associated with ocean acidification, and I have a number of people who have contributed to this work listed down there on the bottom of the slide, particularly Sarah Cooley, who was formerly at Woods Hole and is now at the Ocean Conservancy, was really my co-PI and partner in putting this study together. So if we jump right in, I wasn't sure how many people on the line would be familiar with ocean acidification, and so I'm going to do a little bit of a background. But I want to start out by just asking the question of what is ocean acidification? And it's a progressive increase in the acidity of the ocean over an extended period of time, typically decades or longer, which is caused primarily by the uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But another aspect of ocean acidification is that it can be enhanced by other chemical additions or subtractions from the ocean. And this is what we're seeing in the coastal environment, that there is an accumulation of anthropogenic CO2 in the coastal oceans, but in many places the natural variability or other anthropogenic factors overwhelm that signal of anthropogenic CO2 and actually are more important in the reduction of pH or the reduction of the important carbonate minerals that we're concerned about from the biological impact side of things. And so because of that, ocean acidification can be more severe in areas where human activities such as nutrient runoff or in enclosed estuaries that go through some kind of seasonal cycle of high primary productivity, those places are ultimately going to be more vulnerable to ocean acidification, and we'll see that as we go through the talk. And so it all comes back, as I said, to carbon dioxide, and I'm sure many of you have seen this slide before, but this is the historical record of CO2 in the atmosphere in the large panel going back to the 1700s, and we see CO2 being fairly constant at somewhere around 270 parts per million until we get into the early 1900s and into really the 1950s. And this is where we see that ramping up or that rapid increase in atmospheric CO2 levels due to industrial processes like the burning of fossil fuels is the main driver of this. And so you can see just over this 250 to 300 year time period, CO2 have gone from about 270 up to 400 parts per million. So in May of 2013, we breached that 400 ppm milestone in the atmosphere, which was pretty significant. That was something that even a decade ago we were hoping wouldn't happen, but we went through that barrier pretty quickly, and we're still on a trajectory that's going to take us well past that. And if we stay under this business as usual emission scenario, where we're emitting CO2 at the rate we are today, and in fact that may be expanding as other nations become more and more industrialized, it's very likely and probably almost a certainty at this point that we'll pass 800 parts per million in the atmosphere by the year 2100. And that's really significant because what I've put in this inset box here is CO2 records going back 800,000 years from the ice core records that we have available to us. And while you'll see there is some variability in CO2 in the atmosphere, it ranges from usually around 200 up to 250 or 270 sort of as the maximum value over that 800,000 year time frame. So you can see that even at 400 parts per million, we're well outside of the range of what the Earth has really seen or experienced in that 800,000 year time period. And you can imagine if we go up to 800 ppm, we'll be really in a range that the Earth hasn't seen in hundreds of millions of years. And so the question we ask is, where is all that anthropogenic CO2 coming from? Well, there are two main pools of anthropogenic CO2. The big one that we think about the most is the 7.5 petagrams a year that comes from our industrial sources, mostly the burning of coal and oil. But the other aspect of it that people often forget is the deforestation, the loss of the terrestrial ecosystem that acts as a natural sink for this CO2. And so as deforestation happens and we lose particularly rainforest in the tropics, that contributes another 1.5 petagrams of carbon into the environment. And so we add those two things together and we get a total of 9 petagrams per year of anthropogenic CO2 that's being released into the atmosphere. And I want you to remember, just for scale, that 1 petagram is 22 trillion pounds. So we're releasing 9 of those every year. So it's an extraordinary amount of carbon going into the environment. And so there are 3 reservoirs for this CO2 as it gets emitted into the biosphere. About 45 or 46% of it stays in the atmosphere, and that's what gives us that atmospheric increase that we've seen over the past few centuries, but really in the past 50 to 60 years in particular. Another 30% gets taken up by the terrestrial biosphere. This is the land sink for CO2. And the part that we're going to be most concerned with today is this 26% that gets taken up by the ocean. So in one way, the oceans are doing a great service to the planet by taking up this CO2, and so it is mitigating warming to a certain extent, but we're going to see that this has a tremendous chemical impact on the ocean as this change occurs. And so if we look at one more sort of background slide, to know that this is going on, this is the time series record from the Mauna Loa station in Hawaii and then the ocean time series that's just north of the Hawaiian Islands. And so what's plotted on the top panel here is this is just atmospheric CO2 shown in red. This is what was on the previous slide going back to 1989. And so you see this very consistent increase overlaying this natural seasonal cycle of CO2. But if you look at the blue underneath it is CO2 in the ocean that was taken at Station Aloha here. And you can see the trends are almost identical. And so as CO2 increases in the atmosphere, CO2 is increasing in the ocean simultaneously. And that has a very definitive effect. This plotted down here on the bottom is pH at the same time series. And so you can see over that same amount of time as CO2 has increased in the atmosphere, the pH of the ocean has dropped considerably by a rate of about 0.002 pH units per year. And that may not sound like a lot, but remember that the pH scale is a logarithmic scale, and so it is a considerable change over this time. And even since the Industrial Revolution, the oceans are now 30% more acidic than they were before we started emitting significant quantities of CO2 in the atmosphere. So the change has really been quite dramatic, and we are on a trajectory for this process not only continue, but to accelerate. And so we think there are a couple of scenarios where we can end up based on the IPCC assessment. Really, there are 2 ways we can go. So this is the historical record of average pH in the ocean going back to 1850. And so you can see this sort of slow but steady decline in pH over the last 150 to 200 years or so, which takes us to where we are right now. So we started out at a little bit less than 8.2. We're now down to about 8.1, so the pH has dropped by 0.1 units already. But if we follow these two scenarios out, the RCP 2.6 scenario, which was a sort of best case scenario, which assumed some very significant CO2 mitigation from the international community and a rapid reduction in CO2 emission rates, that would have stabilized pH out to the year 2100 at a value of a little bit less than 8.1, but still within that range that we thought that the oceans would be able to deal with at least over long time periods. Unfortunately, it's unlikely and almost impossible at this point to get to that RCP 2.6 because we just didn't do the mitigation efforts over the past few years that needed to be put into place. So the other scenario that we look at is the RCP 8.5, which assumes business as usual over the next 50 or 60 years, which is looking more and more likely, unfortunately, based on the appetite and the political climate right now of the way we're thinking about CO2. And if we stay on that RCP 8.5 scenario, you see what happens is by the end of the century, we're going to be down at a pH of 7.8 or less, which is well outside of the natural range of what the oceans have experienced over that last sort of several hundred thousand to several millions of years going back in time. And that rate of change is what's most alarming, but we're also concerned about the ultimate value of the pH that we're getting to, because we do have some historical proxies that show us that at certain times the oceans have become a very low pH environment. And if we look back 55 million years ago, we see from the sediment cores that during this event, there was high CO2 in the atmosphere, high CO2 in the ocean, the pH was very low, and there was really a loss or perhaps even a complete extinction of calcifying organisms in the ocean. And this plot just shows you the weight percent of carbonate in the sediment, which should be up close to 100%, but you can see during this event here, shaded in the gray box, the calcium carbonate weight percent is almost zero during this time, which tells us that calcification was greatly reduced, especially in the open ocean. And it is estimated, though, that we are now changing ocean pH somewhere between 10 and 100 times faster than what occurred during this major extinction event. And so the potential is certainly there for us to really impact the global ocean and the organisms that live in it. And so there are a number of impacts that we think the organisms will feel. The obvious ones are things like reduction in calcification rate, but then we think about things like shift in plankton diversity, reduced tolerance to other environmental stressors, changes in fitness and survival, changes in biodiversity. These are the things that there are a number of scientists now that are out there working on in the community that are trying to quantify to a greater degree so that we can understand what the chemical changes are ultimately going to mean for the biological populations, and in many cases, particularly in the coastal environment, those ecosystem resources that we rely on for not only commerce, but also, in the case of Alaska, for an important subsistence source of protein in the diets of many thousands of people. And so there are some other studies going on looking at what may be some of the potential outcomes of this ocean acidification process as it happens. And so one of the main things that's going on right now is looking at this from a genetic standpoint. And we see that there are two really processes that can happen, and both of them are a little bit alarming, and it's why I mention it here, because there is a growing perception that these organisms will just evolve, that evolution will take over, and that these things will be able to deal with high CO2 conditions, and that we shouldn't worry about it. And I think that's a little short-sighted, because we see that from one standpoint, we have a selection process going on from the genetic level where we take a multiple genotype sort of scenario and we reduce the diversity in those genotypes, where we might end up with maybe one or two genotypes with a loss of diversity in that gene pool. The other alarming thing is just simply mutations, which are also showing up. So when these genotypes are exposed to this high CO2 world or high CO2 conditions, the genotypes do mutate into a whole new a whole new genetic basis, and so that's also very concerning when we think about the impact it's going to have on these organisms. I'm sure you've all heard of the pteropod. The pteropods have become the ground zero species, really, for ocean acidification because they have shown some of the most rapid responses when they're exposed to high CO2 conditions. And so we see that from this slide here, where a healthy pteropod shell, which is shown in this figure, is exposed to CO2 conditions in the water that aren't that much different than what we're seeing in a number of places in the coastal ocean today. And you can see from this image from the scanning electron microscope the rapid dissolution in these shells that begins to occur when they are exposed to this water. And for the first time down in the Southern Ocean, there have been observations that these pteropods are dissolving in real time in ocean conditions today. And then since then, we've found similar conditions and similar pteropod dissolutions on the west coast of the U.S. all the way up into Alaska. And so this is a real-time thing. This is happening today. We're still not quite sure what the niche of the pteropod is in the ecosystem. We do know that they are consumed by juvenile pink salmon while they're in the ocean, and they do make up a significant portion of the diet of those juvenile pink salmon. But we're still unclear what a big loss of pteropod biomass would mean for the overall ecosystem as a whole. But they do serve as a great indicator species for the change that we might expect. The things that are a little bit closer to home, at least for us on the West Coast, is the loss of the commercial organisms. And so we see it's not just the pteropods, things like clams also rapidly dissolve when they're exposed to conditions that are high in CO2 and low in pH. And the story that's been told many times now is the failure of the oyster hatcheries in the Pacific Northwest in Washington and Oregon, where these shellfish hatcheries almost went out of business when they were unable to continue to produce their oyster spat because of high CO2, low pH conditions. And it was only through a very extensive monitoring program and a really change in their management structure of how they circulate water through the facility, how they don't pump water into their facility when conditions are such that the CO2 would be high in the water, that they were able to save these shellfish hatcheries, at least in the short term. But it's going to be a struggle going forward for a number of these locations because of the conditions that we see on the West Coast. And so there have been some comprehensive studies that are going on, and this is what led us to start thinking about the economic impacts in Alaska, is that we've got some bad news from a king crab study that was done a couple of years ago that showed that the king crabs weren't going to do as well. There was a 30% lower survival rate in the juvenile king crabs. There was change in their biophysics, and so that got us sort of thinking about the crabs and trying to understand how they fit in the overall economy for Alaska. Then there was some better news for fish, such as pollock, which are also a very important revenue source in the state of Alaska. And the study that was done on pollock showed that at least larval and juvenile pollock, the fish themselves, didn't show a significant response to ocean acidification based on growth or rearing or metabolic functions over the time period which they were reared under. However, since then, there have been a couple of other preliminary studies that have shown there may be some behavioral changes in the fish as CO2 rises. So that got us thinking about developing this risk assessment or this risk index for the fisheries in Alaska. And so we defined risk as the chance that an investment's actual return will be different than expected, and the risk included the possibility of losing some or all of the original investment. And so we put this study together based on three major components, is the first one being ocean acidification itself, the second one being the community vulnerability in Alaska to changes or a loss in revenue or a loss of subsistence, and then looking at the human reliance on marine harvest, the diversity in the community, and how they would respond to those things. And so we started out simply by looking at the oceans and understanding what was going to happen in the ocean over the next few decades. And so we did some hindcasting where we looked at what the pH, the aragonite saturation state, and the aragonite saturation state horizon was in the decade from 1880 to 1889, because we wanted to know sort of what was going on before these really rapid progressive changes started to occur. And then we compared that to model results from the decade from 2003 to 2012. We validated these results with our observations that we're making around the state of Alaska to see just how the conditions had changed from the 1880s to where we are today. And so you can see pH has dropped by about 0.1 pH units. Aragonite saturation state has been reduced, and the saturation horizon is shoaling closer to the surface. And then we projected out to the year 2095, and we can see it's very dramatic changes that are going to occur in the next sort of 80 years. See, pH gets down to this 7.8 to even 7.6 range in all three oceans around Alaska, the Arctic, the Bering Sea, and the Gulf of Alaska. The saturation state for aragonite is below 1 in all areas and all months of the year. So the waters will be perennially undersaturated in aragonite from the surface to the bottom. And as you can see from this figure down here, which is all white, which just means that the saturation horizon has shoaled all the way to the surface. So we see this is a very significant change that's going to occur around the state. And we coupled that to where the habitat is for the vulnerable species. And so we looked at the crabs and the clams, and we looked at gooey ducks, which are down here in southeastern Alaska. And so we developed this habitat range so we can compare where the organisms are living, particularly where the commercial or subsistently important organisms are living, and so we could relate that to the changes that are happening in the water chemistry. And then we started looking at revenues. We looked at the number of species that were commercially caught in the state in 2011, and this was the biggest fraction is calcifying predators, so the things that are eating the calcifiers. So these are our pollock and our salmon and our halibut, things that rely on planktonic calcifiers or larval calcifiers at some point during their life stage. And then we looked at the other things like crabs directly, clams, scallops, those things that you can see. If you break this out, only a very small part, this unaffected blue here, are the only species that potentially won't be affected by ocean acidification in Alaska. And then we broke it down one step further, where we looked at the weight and revenue of the commercial harvest of each one of these species. And so the filled bars is the commercial harvest in pounds, and the white or open bars are the dollar value. And so you can see that something like the crab fishery in Alaska is worth almost $1 billion. The calcifying predators, which include salmon, is worth over $1 billion. So these are significant dollar amounts that these fisheries represent for not only the GDP of the state of Alaska, but for also the nation as a whole. And so once we knew the total value of these fisheries, we began to break it down on a burrow-by-burrow basis. So Alaska is broken up into a number of burrows, and each burrow has a different reliance on different fisheries. And so we looked at places like the Fairbanks North Star burrow, which is an interior burrow in the state, and their revenue in that burrow is solely derived from salmon. You see, though, as you go into the more coastal areas, like Kodiak Island or Juneau or Ketchikan, if you look at these labels down here on the bottom, you see that the diversity of the catch becomes quite distinct for each place. And then we looked at the harvest quantity estimates, how much each one of these burrows were catching, to determine the revenue that was entering these places from these different fisheries. And then we began plugging all this in to our model framework, and so ultimately we wanted to get at this OA risk assessment, and we really defined it as having three components. The first one was hazard, and hazard was just ocean acidification, how the water is going to change over time. The second part was exposure, and it was exposure from both an economic and a nutritional standpoint. So this captures the commercial value of the fishery, but also the subsistence value of the fishery, which is very important in a number of these communities where they derive most, if not all, of their protein from fishing throughout the year. And the last part, which was the place where we really pushed ourselves the hardest, was vulnerability, because we wanted to understand on a community-by-community basis what a loss of the fishery would mean. And so we broke it into sensitivity, which was also economic and nutritional, and compositional and quantity, so how much they were catching and the diversity of what they were catching. but then also this adaptive capacity, which was looking at things like the size of the economy, the industrial diversity, the individual income, food accessibility, and educational attainment. And so this, from a very sort of social sciences or an economist standpoint, was trying to figure out, if you took a fishery out of the equation, do these communities have the resiliency or the opportunity to rebound into something new? And in a lot of places, we found that unfortunately that just wasn't the case. And so when we put all this together, we came up with this index, and it's scaled here on this first little breakdown up here on the left-hand side of the figure. And the red areas are the places with the highest final index, which means these communities are most vulnerable to a loss of fisheries because of ocean acidification. And you can see it immediately stands out as Southwest and Southeast Alaska. These are the communities with the heaviest reliance on commercial and subsistence fishing. They're also the areas with the highest protein replacement cost, which means that if you took crab or salmon out of the diet for a lot of these people, they couldn't just go down to the grocery store and easily replace that with chicken or beef or imported fish from somewhere else, just because the cost is too high. And so we broke it out this way, and we really found that these regions, and here's the top 10 listed in this box here, are the most vulnerable and the most sensitive to ocean acidification in the very near future. The yellow areas are the ones with the medium to sort of intermediate range. You can see that's still western Alaska. It's still down here in southeastern Alaska. It just means that these communities may have a few more opportunities from an economic standpoint or an industrial standpoint. And then finally, you see the interior parts of the state, or particularly the commercial regions like Anchorage, that have a slightly lower index just because they have more diversity and they're not as heavily reliant on the fisheries. So what we know right now, we know that ocean acidification has been well documented with global observations conducted over several decades, and that it's been definitively attributed to human-generated CO2 in the atmosphere. We know that changes in the carbonate chemistry force marine organisms to spend more energy regulating chemistry in their cells, but some organisms may have more stress than others under these conditions, and because of that, the biological impacts of ocean acidification will vary. We know that the impacts from ocean acidification at any life stage can reduce the ability of a population to grow or recover from other stressors, and even have a direct effect, which we saw on the Pacific oyster larvae down here in the hatcheries in Washington and Oregon. And we know that many of Alaska's commercial and subsistence fisheries are co-located in areas that have and will undergo significant changes to ocean acidification. But we also have to think about what we don't know. And this is something I really like to point out in all my talks, is that ocean acidification will not kill all ocean life. There's just going to be a change in the species composition of the organisms that are living in the oceans. The oceans have and always will be productive, but we may switch out calcifying organisms for things like algae and seagrass. And I don't know too many people that enjoy going to a restaurant and having a big plate of seagrass for dinner. I think everybody enjoys king crab every once in a while. But those are the types of things we need to keep in mind, is that the ocean may just look very different over the next couple of hundred years. There's also the issue from evolutionary adaptivity, and that right now, even though organisms do show some adaptive capability to ocean acidification, we have to remember that long-term pH decline will at some point exceed the natural variability that occurs in a lot of these coastal environments. So right now, an animal that naturally experiences an annual pH swing from 7.9 to 8.2 or 8.3, at some point, ocean acidification will get to the point that it's going to take the water out of that natural range and may get down into that 7.7 or 7.8 range. And once that happens, it's still unclear whether that evolutionary process will be able to keep up with that rate of change. And that from the geoengineering standpoint, I haven't heard anything to date that addresses ocean acidification, that all the efforts from geoengineering are in a way related to cooling the planet, but not actually capturing the CO2. And so we have to remove that CO2 from the environment in order to reduce the effects of ocean acidification. So up in Alaska, we're monitoring the environment, obviously. We've got a number of moorings that are out, and so this is a mooring down in the southern part of Alaska, just outside of the community of Seward, where we're monitoring sea surface temperature and salinity. You can see from this plot, this is the difference in CO2 in the water versus the difference in CO2 in the atmosphere. And so you can see, particularly during the spring and summer months, CO2 in the water is much lower than CO2 in the atmosphere because of primary productivity. But then that delta CO2 goes down as you go in the winter months as productivity slows down. But the removal of CO2 from primary production actually is a sort of anti-ocean acidification effect. And so we see that pH in these locations is relatively high, but it does come back down to about 8.0 or a little less than 8.0 during the wintertime. So in some regions, this variability has continued to stave off the broader effects of ocean acidification because productivity will continue to drive down CO2 in the spring and summer months, but this baseline will continue to shift further and further up. This delta will get lower and lower as productivity just can't overcome the amount of CO2 that's being emitted into the ocean. The other very exciting thing we're doing in Alaska from a monitoring standpoint is we're putting systems inside shellfish hatcheries around the state in the response to the stakeholders asking us to help them monitor their waters, just like we've been doing in Washington and Oregon for the past couple of years. And so we did do that in a shellfish hatchery down in Seward. We're monitoring pH and CO2 in the hatchery, and you can see, again, this is just a delta CO2 plot where you can see the red are places where the water that they're pumping into the hatchery is higher than CO2 in the atmosphere, and the blues are the places where it's lower. And we also measured pH. You can see ranged usually from about 8.1 down to a little less than 8.0, and then we're able to calculate the aragonite saturation state. As you can see, it sort of falls off from a maximum of about 2 to 2.4, and then it slowly starts to come down in the wintertime. We see values of about 1.6 at the end of January, and we're continuing this. This is just the latest updated data that I have from the location. But we are seeing that while aragonite isn't getting to 1 quite yet, we're seeing that we are approaching 1, which is pretty alarming for this hatchery, given the impacts that we've seen in the hatcheries in Washington and Oregon. And so I want to finish with some thoughts about management and thinking about what's going to happen as we go forward. The Alaska commercial fisheries, for example, have a great history of opportunistically switching from species to species based on availability and marketability. And so a good example of that was in the 1980s in the Gulf of Alaska. There was a major shrimp fishery, and then there was a big shift in the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the PDO. And the shrimp literally just disappeared from one year to the next. And so the shrimp fishery went away, but those communities were able to switch to catching groundfish and finfish, things like pollock and halibut and salmon. And most of these communities did fine. They made the transition very quickly. The guy went from catching shrimp to catching fish, and he was able to weather that without any great impact to the economy. A far more ominous example, though, is what happened in Prince William Sound when the Exxon Valdez oil spill occurred, and that caused a near-complete collapse of the herring fishery, which was critical to that region. And once the herring fishery was lost, a number of communities just shut down completely. The loss of revenue was something that they couldn't deal with, and then also from the subsistence standpoint, many of the native communities around the Prince William Sound area that relied on the herring for the majority of their protein were not able to survive, or the communities shrank significantly because of the loss of herring. So we have these two examples where on the one hand there is some resiliency in the fisheries where they can make a shift, but on the other hand we see that if it happens too quickly or to a greater degree, they can't survive. And so we're really recommending that these regions, particularly those in southwest and southeast Alaska that are most vulnerable, they start thinking about diversifying their economy, looking at other sectors, other natural resources, or encouraging other industries to come into those communities so that they could potentially weather a storm if the changes did start to occur because of ocean acidification. And that's why I think not just in Alaska, but all around the coastal U.S., we need effective management strategies to think about dealing with those issues. But we also have to keep in mind the 6 mistakes executives make in risk management. And so I pulled this out of the Harvard Business Review, and I really wanted to go through these because I think this is a very important thing to consider, is for number one, to think that you can manage risk by predicting extreme events. And I just went through these with you, but not only can we not predict the unpredictable, but by focusing on it, we neglect to predict and are unable to prepare for the unpredictable. And so that's just the black swan theory, that we can be prepared, but we're still not going to be able to deal with the unknowns. And so we can't convince ourselves that we'll just manage the fisheries and everything will be okay. And that leads us to number 2, which is to think that studying the past will help you manage future risk. We do see proxies for previous ocean acidification conditions, but we do know that the oceans are different today than they were 55 million years ago when the last high CO2 event occurred. And so they're going to respond differently. And also to not listening to advice about what we should not do. We should not do stupid things like loading the atmosphere up with CO2 and then thinking we can solve the problem through other means later on down the road. We should just not cause the problem in the first place. And that takes us back to this sort of urgency that we need to be thinking about in terms of mitigation. Number 4 is to assume that risk can be measured by standard deviation. This is another thing, that even though we're out monitoring the oceans and we're doing a great job of monitoring, we can't convince ourselves that just because we're monitoring that we'll be able to fully predict everything that's going to happen. We need to understand risk dependence and how it is expressed and how we're going to communicate that. And I'm going to talk about that on the next slide as my sort of a concluding remark. And then finally, that we need to forget that, or don't forget that efficiency and maximizing shareholder value do not tolerate redundance. We need ecosystem resiliency to survive. We can't just let these ecosystems evolve such that only the organisms that have a tolerance to high CO2 survive, because those organisms that have a high tolerance to CO2 may have a lower tolerance to some other stressor that we're not thinking about or we're not dealing with yet. And because of that loss of resiliency, we could go into an extinction event or even a bigger extinction event than what we're seeing today. And so we have just completed a survey around the state about number 5, which was what do people think, and we've got some very surprising results around the state. This is one of my graduate students, Lauren Frisch, shown here in the picture, and she surveyed several thousand people around the state, and she got some interesting answers. She asked questions like, do members of your family have a job catching fish? But then we also broke that down into, do you think ocean acidification will impact Alaska more than other states? And so you can see that breakdown on this middle slide. And then in your opinion, is there a direct link between statewide revenues for Alaska fisheries and ocean acidification? And so what we got out of the study is a couple of things. Is that number 1, we're not doing a good enough job communicating our OA message around the state, because most people, or at least a large fraction of the people, didn't see it as a big risk in the near term. And then we also need to make a better connection of not just in Alaska, but to the nation as a whole, that the economic consequences for a loss of fishery is going to cascade through the entire economy. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars of revenue that's generated and that supports a significant part of the GDP of the U.S. And so I think this survey provided some unique insights, and I would like to see this done in all the regions around the U.S. to see where our messaging can get better in communicating about ocean acidification. So just finally, some really general final thoughts, that there are still many uncertainties associated with ocean acidification, but we do know that major catastrophic event could be coming if changes aren't implemented. Even though we have made some progress, we still cannot predict the exact costs, casualties, and damage, but we do know how to prevent them, which is just simply to significantly mitigate our CO2 emissions. And finally, we have to think about short-term adaptation strategies while developing intermediate and long-term structural changes in our energy policy. So with that, I'll stop, and I see some questions have already started popping up on the chat, so I'll be happy to take those.
Thanks very much, Jeremy.